Hello, my name is Naomi Sultan and I am an attorney at Mental Health Advocacy Services. Mental Health Advocacy Services is a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles that provides free legal services to low-income people with mental health disabilities. This is the first of 3 educational videos we will be making in the next several months about the fair housing rights of people using housing subsidies like Section 8. In this first video, I'll discuss one of the most common barriers that people with disabilities experience when trying to lease an apartment in the private market using a housing subsidy: being priced out of the market. I will then discuss how folks, depending on their circumstances, may be able to request a reasonable accommodation under fair housing laws to help find an affordable unit. Market rents are unaffordable to many people with disabilities, including those who rely on supplemental security income known as SSI. For example, average rent for a 1-bedroom apartment in Los Angeles is about $2,450 per month, more than twice the typical monthly SSI amount in California. This large gap between income and rental rates explains why so many people with disabilities need housing subsidies, like a federal Section 8 voucher, to afford rent. With Section 8, a person usually pays only about 1/3 of their income, whatever that might be, towards rent. The government, through the local public housing authority, pays the rest of the rent to the landlord. It can be really hard to get a Section 8 voucher. Nationally, only about 20% of low-income renters needing federal rental assistance actually receive it. Even once they get a voucher, folks with disabilities face challenges to leasing a unit on the private market for several reasons. One of these reasons is that the voucher payment standard, which dictates the maximum rent for a Section 8 subsidized apartment, is lower than the average rent for an apartment. In the city of Los Angeles, as I mentioned previously, the average 1-bedroom apartment rent is more than $2,450. But Section 8 will only pay up to $1,924 for a 1-bedroom apartment. This means that the majority of apartments, by virtue of cost alone, are out of reach for Section 8 voucher holders. However, it still may be possible to find an apartment to rent with a Section 8 voucher. As of October 2022, Affordability.com lists 149 1-bedroom apartments for rent that are under the local payment standard. Apartments.com lists about 800 1-bedroom apartments that may be affordable to City of LA voucher holders. Note that folks with disabilities can request what's called an exception payment standard as a reasonable accommodation if they need to rent a more expensive apartment due to their disabilities. For example, none of the 149 1-bedroom units in Los Angeles listed on Affordability.com that are under the local Section 8 payment standard are fully accessible to a person using a wheelchair. So a person who has a Section 8 voucher and requires wheelchair accessibility might need to request a higher exception payment standard in order to find suitable, affordable housing on the private market. The same might be true for a person with mental disabilities. For example, a person with anxiety might have increased sensitivity to noise and require a freestanding unit with no shared walls. There are many such courtyard type units in Los Angeles, but the rent on such units often exceeds what is covered by a Section 8 voucher. Again, in this situation, under fair housing laws, you can request an exception payment standard in order to afford a suitable place to live. Unfortunately, you can only request a waiver to the payment standard as a reasonable accommodation of your disability after you have located a suitable unit. Requests for exception payment standards in some expensive housing markets like Los Angeles currently must go to HUD headquarters in Washington, D.C. for approval, which can take several months. Meanwhile, the landlord will typically not hold a unit while the request is pending, and they will rent it to another prospective tenant who doesn't use a voucher. People with disabilities struggling to find appropriate housing may therefore have more success increasing the size of their voucher rather than seeking to increase the voucher payment standard. Let's look at the example of a couple experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles who has been granted a one-bedroom Section 8 voucher. As a result of a violent attack on their tent, they both experience PTSD-related night terrors, and each needs to sleep in their own private bedroom. They can request that the housing authority grant them a two-bedroom voucher as a reasonable accommodation for their mental health disabilities. The voucher payment standard for a two-bedroom voucher in the city of Los Angeles is $2,452 per month. With a two-bedroom voucher, it may be easier to afford a unit under the voucher payment standard. As of October 2022, AffordableHousing.com lists only 149 one-bedroom apartments affordable with a one-bedroom Section 8 voucher in Los Angeles, but it lists 268 two-bedroom apartments affordable with a two-bedroom voucher in Los Angeles. That's about an 80% increase in availability. Also, it helps that a reasonable accommodation request to increase voucher size can be made before a unit is located, such as during the application process for the voucher or while searching for a unit. If you need an exception payment standard or to increase your voucher size due to disability, make a reasonable accommodation request to your Section 8 worker. Explain the connection between the change you are requesting and your disability or disabilities. Reasonable accommodation requests don't have to be in writing and don't have to use any particular language, but it's always best to make the request in writing so that you have a record. The written request can even be submitted by email. Housing authorities often have a process for requesting reasonable accommodations, and they may ask you to fill out a form as part of this process. They cannot require you to fill out any particular form to request a reasonable accommodation, but you may want to use their form to speed up the process. Along with your reasonable accommodation request, it can be helpful to provide the housing authority a letter from a third party that explains your disability and how your disability impacts your housing needs. Any individual with knowledge of your disability and the related need for the accommodation can provide the letter. However, verification from treating professionals may be most effective. This letter does not need to specify what your disabilities are, just that you have them and how the reasonable accommodation you are requesting will help to provide you equal access to housing. Under fair housing law, an accommodation is reasonable and must be granted if it is necessary due to the disability, does not impose an undue burden, usually meaning that it's too expensive, on the housing authority, and does not fundamentally alter the way the housing authority does business. If you are asking for an exception payment standard to accommodate your disability, the higher the dollar amount of your request, the more likely it is that the housing authority will deny your request on the basis of undue burden. If the housing authority denies your reasonable accommodation request, you may wish to pursue an appeal through the housing authority's disability coordinator. You can also file a complaint on the basis of disability discrimination with a local fair housing agency. In California, we have the California Civil Rights Department or the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. You may also contact a legal aid attorney to help you appeal your denial or to file a follow-up request with the housing authority. Thank you for watching this video. Our next video will discuss discrimination based on source of income, which is refusal by landlords to accept lawful sources of income like Section 8 and other housing subsidies, and what people experiencing this type of discrimination can do about it.